There we go. We're live.
We are live. Calling Chris Anderson in London. Chris Anderson.
London calling. Rick Beyer.
How are you today in London?
I'm doing well. It's a beautiful sunny day in London.
And they've started playing football again.
They have, but we're not going to talk about that because it just
didn't go well for your team.
Did not go well for our team.
I'm so sorry. Well, we want to welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Hi, Duncan. And we want to please text us, comment, to say hello. Let us know that you're here. And we'll let a few people get on before we kind of commence with the open and the heart of the show. Chris, happy Father's Day.
Same to you, and happy Father's Day to fathers listening.
Absolutely. And hello to Doreen and Kathy Hurst and Joe Strauss and Susan. And Chris, did anybody do anything for you this Father's Day?
We did, yes. Anna and Madeline cooked me dinner, and Madeline got all masked up and gloved up and walked down to the Tesco and waited in line to buy me a nice bag of peanuts and a fancy cake. Oh,
fantastic.
Yeah.
I want to say also we're getting some people adding on here. Hi to Doreen and Nancy and Mike and George Luz and Bob in Wisconsin. And hi, Neil and Robert, Tom, Ted, Lizzie. We have quite a crew here joining us. So Marilyn made me breakfast this morning. Nice omelet. So it was a very nice way to start the day. So it's a happy Father's Day to everyone. And as Chris said, that's a father who's joining us. So, of course, Chris, what time is it? It's time for the History Happy Hour. So the bar is open.
The bar is open.
Happy Hour is on the air. And I want to give people a chance to drink early. Our topic today is Lawrence of Arabia, and our guest is standing by. But I want to give people a chance to drink early today, Chris. So I just wanted to tell you, what do you think came? We got a package via UPS the other day. What do you think came?
With you, Rick, it's hard to say.
Well, we got via UPS an inflatable tank.
As you would.
I think everybody should have an inflatable tank, and I have had several because we use it for exhibits to promote what, Chris? You can think of
Enemy Events of Death?
Yes. No. Ghost Army. All right.
Ghost Army. First drink of the show. Yep.
Yes. And so, and we tried to, because it's new, we wanted to inflate it to make sure that it works and everything.
Yep.
Made by my friend Tony McKay, who's made several inflatable tanks for us. And unfortunately, the community room of our apartment building, just a little small for this life-size Sherman tank inflatable.
How small was it, Rick?
Caused a little bit of a problem there. I did survive barely. So I think we're gonna have to find some other place to.
Was that an inflatable Panzer that got you, or what?
Nice, friendly fire, my friend. Friendly fire. So our topic today is Lawrence of Arabia and the British military mission to Arabia. And our guest is joining us today is James Stejskal. James, how are you doing?
Hey, James.
Good afternoon to both of you.
Or evening in Chris's case. And I want to say that James is an author, a military historian, a conflict archaeologist. He's a veteran of Special Forces, U.S. Army Special Forces. Is that
correct? Yeah.
A veteran of the CIA. And so I'm sure there's all sorts of interesting things he won't be able to tell us about. And he's also the author of several fascinating books, one of which is Masters of Mayhem. I am holding it up here, and I will just let you all see it. Masters of Mayhem, which is about Lawrence and the British military mission to Hejaz in 1916 to 1918. So did you bring a cocktail, James?
And this is it.
Okay.
But you haven't mentioned the Ghost Army, so I can't drink.
Well, you just mentioned it, so we.
Ghost Army.
And I have
gin and tonic.
I have Chris. I have a Hollows and Fentimans ginger beer from 1905. I don't believe this particular bottle is
It's aged well.
but it was in honor of our topic.
I have a Spitfire.
Spitfire, it's the old standby.
There we go.
So our topic today is Lawrence of Arabia and the British military mission. So James, I wanted to start out. You were in Special Forces. You operated in the Middle East during Operation Desert Storm. I'm sure you've been there multiple times since. Was it your career that led you to want to write about Lawrence and write about the British military mission?
Oh, I think I started writing about history even before I was in the Army. I was very interested in it. And I knew of Lawrence basically with the debut of the movie in 1963, I think. So I had followed his career, and Lawrence, there he is.
There's Peter O'Toole.
Looks nothing like him and is about 6 inches taller than he. But anyway, Lawrence was a guy that we actually studied when I was at the Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg. Him amongst others.
So that's kind of what got you there. And what interests you about Lawrence, and what interests you about this story?
Well, it's an unusual story. He was, by all accounts or by all descriptions, really an amateur. He was not a career military officer, although he studied military strategy and tactics. He read all the great warrior philosophers of his time and long before. And his story was just very interesting. The fact that he took bicycle rides through the continent of Europe when he was a young man, and also traveled to the Middle East on his own to do one of his final theses, was also very interesting to me. He was an archaeologist, a map maker, sort of a Renaissance man. He didn't play any musical instruments that I know of, but he did have a really nice motorcycle.
So, yeah, I mean, James, I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on that, because, you know, if you look at his life, I mean, he's a 20-something-year-old Oxford archaeologist who's, by all accounts, painfully shy. He has no military experience whatsoever. But by the end of it, he's commanding a revolutionary army. Some could argue he's kind of the political mastermind of this Arab revolt. So how does somebody like that, with that sort of background and beginning, wind up having the position he does in this Arab revolt? I mean, I just kind of been amazed by that.
I think some of it was happenstance. Some of it was the fact that he knew the right people. And a lot of things just fell in place. I mean, before the war, he was part of sort of a red herring operation where the British military sent surveyors into Palestine and the Middle East. This is 1913, 1914. They surveyed the area that he would later operate in. So he became sort of a subject matter expert on the topography, the geology, and archaeological history of the area, even before World War I. The fact that he had studied archaeology and traveled also to see the Crusader castles in the region set him up as one of the premier cultural intelligence officers, you might call it, similar to Gertrude Bell, but he also learned Arabic well and was one of the few British officers, well, there were many, but they were one of the few that could actually work with the different tribes well. He had empathy for the Arabs. What a lot of military officers lack when they're working with indigenous forces. That's to put it mildly.
Right.
Well, go ahead, Chris.
No, go.
No, first I was going to invite our audience to chime in with questions that you have for James, or just things you'd like to know about this topic. One of the things, if you watch the movie, it almost seems like Lawrence is there all by himself. It's Lawrence of Arabia and King Faisal and an occasional stuffy British officer sticking their nose in. Not quite like that in reality, is it?
No. From the very beginning, there are more people involved than Lawrence. There was what was euphemistically described as a pilgrimage officer that went to Mecca and Medina, Colonel Wilson, who was basically one of the advance officers into the region. He was sent over there by General Wingate, who was in charge of the military in the condominium of the Sudan. He was located in Khartoum. Wingate was one of the first guys that realized that the Arabs could be a valuable adjunct to the military in that region. There were other intelligence officers that went into the area before Lawrence, so he was sort of a follow-on. What happened afterwards is that he was sort of thrown to the top of the heap, both because of his military knowledge, his acumen, his empathy with the Arabs, his ability to work with them, but also some just happenstance kind of incidents that put him where he ended up, essentially.
So James, just because I know most people's frame of reference for Lawrence is the movie, and I don't want to get too down into the weeds with this, but briefly, what's the background of the revolt? And if somebody didn't know anything about Lawrence of Arabia, other than the fact that they've seen the movie, what's going on there? Why is he there? Really simple introduction.
Well, it's I think something that we continue to see today. It's a geographic power struggle. At that time, the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, controlled much of the region. The British were in Egypt. They had declared Egypt a protectorate, primarily because of the Suez Canal and making sure that their supplies could get through to Europe. But the Ottoman Empire controlled basically everything south and east of their country. They control what is today Syria, Jordan, a lot of Saudi Arabia. They also controlled Iraq and the coastal areas of that area. That was partially about oil. It was also, but that was actually just coming into the view. And the Arabs felt themselves under the domination of the Turks, and a number of the Arab tribes wanted to break free. And that was what General Wingate, Colonel Clayton in Cairo, and a number of other British officers and political advisors saw. That they saw the Arabs as a possible ally to the British to fight against the Turks when the Turks decided to ally themselves with the Germans.
Okay. So you have said that that the operations that Lawrence was involved in, and that the other members of the British military mission were involved in, were sort of you've suggested it's sort of the birth of British special operations. And one of the things I think you said is that this campaign offered a new methodology of combined special operations. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. The Desert Campaign, the Arab Revolt, as most people call it now, although there are two Arab revolts, it was really an evolutionary process. When they first came into the war, they were fighting almost against the Turkish forces. That did not go real. They kind of ended up over the first year, what I am calling phase one. It was their dangerous year. They learned that they could not attack Turkish fortified positions with camels and horses when the Turks had fortified it with cannon and machine guns. So it was a learning process. And Lawrence was there to see this happen, but he also understood the political dimensions of what was going on. The British were no more altruistic than the French or the Turkish or the Germans. The British wanted to control the area. Lawrence saw that the Arabs needed to move north, and to do that, they had to change their tactics. And so this is the beginning of the evolution. The British Navy, the Royal Navy, was working with them. The Royal Flying Corps was doing aerial surveillance. And at the beginning, it was a lot of mobile hit and run raids based off the back of a horse or the back of a camel. And then into year 2 and year 3 of the war, it began to evolve into more combined operations. But like I said, it was an evolutionary process.
So James, would you say though that, I mean, were there is Lawrence original in his thought, or is he simply taking kind of things that have been done before and repackaging them?
Well, I think the tactics that they were using, these are age-old tactics. I mean, doing raids off the back of a horse is second nature to the Bedouin. They've been doing it for thousands of years. Naval operations against fixed positions on the coast, nothing new about that. But to combine these operations, make them all work, that was really where they started to make a difference.
And there was also, aerial, the Royal Flying Corps involved and the Armored Car Squadron involved. So you really have land, sea, and air all together.
Yeah. The Royal Flying Corps began by doing reconnaissance flights, and then they upped the game and started bombing critical infrastructure, railroad yards, switching facilities, actual Turkish fortifications. But as we say even today, the Air Force cannot hold ground. They can drop a bomb on it, but after that happens, you need to move in the infantry. And so what Lawrence began to do was to coordinate their reconnaissance and offensive capabilities of the airplanes and couple that with his mobile operations. Not the Turkish, but the Arab cavalry and the Arab foot soldiers later on. There's the Arab cavalry. And then they began to get mobile artillery, small breech-loading guns that actually came from India, and Rolls-Royce armored cars that provided a great deal of firepower that they could actually use to go up against a hardened Turkish target. And those are two of the armored cars, a 303 Lewis machine gun mounted on top. They were quite formidable. The Turkish they could damage them, but they never knocked one out.
So I want to come back to the armored cars, but we have a couple of questions I wanted to bring up from our audience. Catherine Beyer-Hurst asks, what was the biggest thing that the movie got wrong, and the one thing it portrayed the best, in your opinion? So you probably think it got a lot of things wrong, so you'll have to choose there.
Well, Catherine, it's been a long time since I've seen the movie, but what I would say is that they portrayed Lawrence as an individual, and he was really working with a lot of other people. So I think that overall is probably the biggest fault that I saw. There are a lot of small technical details, but it's Hollywood, so what do you expect?
I want to jump in just to say that when we first put this picture up, we were looking before the show started. Immediately, James goes, "Wrong gun, wrong gun."
Yeah. that gun shown in the movie is this gun, not this one specifically, but it's a Webley Mark IV. It was a favorite of the British Empire. The only problem was Lawrence didn't like it. You know, a lot of people call Lawrence a traditional kind of guy, but he was actually very attuned to the technological aspects of the military. And that's one of the things that added into his knowledge was he saw what the airplanes could do. He saw the Rolls-Royce armored cars. When he was stationed in Cairo, he actually went out to help in the rescue of some British sailors that were being held by Arab rebels. And the Duke of Westminster's armored car squadron was the one that he went out and helped with the mapping. So he saw the potential. And there's a very good book called something or other, and I can't remember what it is, but it's basically the rescue of the sailors from the HMS Tara.
Okay.
And they were held for several months out in the desert, and the Duke of Westminster went to get them. So he understood all the technological aspects. But even before World War I, he had a Mauser, semi-automatic pistol, and then he had an American missionary lady, what would become Lebanon. She went back to the United States, and he asked her to buy 2 Colt 1911 automatic pistols.
Wow.
And one of those went to his brother, who was killed on the front in France. The other one went to Lawrence. And there's a picture existent of Lawrence with that pistol. So that's what he preferred to carry. He also carried, instead of a rifle, he carried a Lewis gun, an aerial type Lewis gun that did not have a heavy barrel jacket. And he had a sheath for the thing built or made so that he could carry the weapon on his camel as he went cross country. So he had his very own pistol and his very own machine gun. He was very attuned to the technological aspects. That's why he called the Rolls-Royce the best car, and why he later on bought a really nice motorcycle. I keep coming to that. Anyway.
To die for.
Correct.
Yeah, oh, that was good, Rick.
Yeah, the best thing about the movie, I think the best thing about it was they brought Lawrence back into the limelight. I mean, there are a lot of good scenes in that movie. The train ambush at Halat Amar, where he's up on top of the car, the railway car after they derail it. Well, a bit over the top is very accurate, actually.
Well, and I just, I will jump in before Chris asks a question to just say about the movie that I love, although it's not particularly, it's been criticized as not realistic. I do love the attack of Aqaba scene. And what I do think is realistic is that in working with Faisal on his men on the attack on Aqaba, that really is where Lawrence kind of goes solo. A little bit, where he's with them. He is kind of not so much at this point, at least to my knowledge, paying attention to his orders. He's kind of got his own idea of what he wants to do, and to get the Arabs into Aqaba, and then to be able to go back to Cairo, crossing Suez, and report on that.
Well, Chris, I think kind of alluded to that before about following the precepts and the rules of Roger's rules of warfare, to call it. He actually went against orders to go north. And he decided the only way that he could do this, the only way to move the Arabs north, was to secure a secure port by which they could continue to supply the Arabs. And Aqaba was the place to do it. He had also done a study when he was in Cairo before he joined the military mission that said basically to take Aqaba from the sea would be impossible because the Turks it was a town that's built at the end of a valley and easily defended. But he realized as well from the landward side, it could be overcome. And he decided to do that. He knew that Faisal wanted to move north, and King Hussein, or who would become King Hussein, wanted to do that. But he also knew that if he told the command, his commanders, that they would say not just no, but hell no. They wanted the Arabs to stay south, to isolate the Turks around Mecca and Medina, and not go north, because if they went north, then they could claim more territory. The British didn't want that. So he was going not only against military orders, he was going against the political stratagem of the time.
So, well, one of the questions, I've got a lot of questions about Lawrence, but another one of the things that I was curious about, or to get your thoughts on, is how much he changed the Arab army and the way they fight, and how he was able to turn them into a force that could actually function, albeit in a unique way, but function in that kind of environment to achieve goals larger than just looting or a raid, or it becomes a much bigger thing.
Well, this is where a lot of other people come into the fold. There were a number of advisors. The picture that you showed of the Arab cavalry, for example, there were Arab officers who had served with the Turkish army who became advisors to this group of people. There was also British and Arab Turkish officers who worked with the ground forces, the infantry forces. And there were a number of British officers who also worked with these elements, because Lawrence was basically an advisor, a counselor to Faisal. And he could not be everywhere at once. So you've got all these other British officers who are working right up close with the Arab army, the Northern Arab army especially, but there was also a Southern Arab army down south that was advised by a British officer by the name of Davenport. Without these people, Lawrence's ideas would never have gelled.
You sent us this picture, and these are some of the folks who worked with him. Lieutenant Gilman in the middle, who is the commander of the Armored Car Squadron, the Hejaz Armored Car Squadron. And who else is in this picture?
Well, Colonel Joyce in the middle with the black headdress. He was really, he was sort of like the operations maestro that served first in the south and then came up to Aqaba after that was taken. And without him, the supplies and resources would have never gotten to Lawrence. He was basically the intermediary. Lawrence would talk to him, and Joyce would counsel him. Joyce would then either agree or disagree with Lawrence, but whatever they decided, Joyce would be basically the one that would forward the instructions to Cairo and ask for the assistance. A number of other officers that are in there, the head of the mobile artillery detachment, which was extremely small. Two of the officers are engineers who helped blow things up and taught the Arabs how to use explosives and how to destroy things. So that's just a small number there, but there's 35 to 40 officers total.
You mentioned somebody in this photo that you don't even know his real name, but the photo is annotated on the back, and it says Flannelfoot. And I challenge somebody to come up with his identity. It would be a revelation. But yes, can we figure out who Flannelfoot is? We'll have to. We now have at least 50 people who are madly Googling to try to get you that information. But,
I wish them luck, and I hope to hear from them soon.
Well, so James, what was it about Lawrence that made the Arab army, made Faisal and his dad? What made them say, yeah, okay, Lawrence is okay?
One, he spoke the language, which
right.
is always a good thing. although there were other officers that were well respected that did not speak the language. But he did not. One of the best things he came up with was his 27 rules, which was basically a guideline for counterinsurgency, for guerrilla warfare advisors. And one of the things he says is, let the Arabs do what they can do well. Don't try to make them do it our way or make them do it perfectly. He realized that he had to empower them to do what they needed to do, because the advisors cannot go out there and do it themselves. They cannot lead from the front. They need to lead from the back and tell the local leaders how to go about it or help advise them. There were a lot of the Arabs that knew mobile warfare already from their history of raids and ambushes and skirmishes. So he wasn't really bringing them any new tactics, but what he was doing was advising them on how to fight better against a more formidable force.
So the 27 rules, the 27 articles document is one that you actually printed in the back of your book. And I think we're also going to try to post a link to that for folks. But it really is kind of it's Lawrence's guide on how to be Lawrence. It seems to me is kind of what it is. He advises officers in a situation like this to wear native clothing, to leave English customs behind, to always keep on their guard, maintain a sense of humor, be sort of invisible in a way, always deal only with the commanding officer. And these have kind of developed a life of their own, haven't they? I mean, there's a lot of people over the years, organizations, commanders, guerrilla leaders who've been interested in and learned from these, it sounds like.
Well, yeah. Most recently, I think General Petraeus, who was the overall editor of the Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Manual, plagiarized the heck out of Lawrence, although he did give some reference to the origin of most of his material. Petraeus didn't write everything. There were a lot of other officers involved, but a lot of his ideas were in there. Mao Zedong of China referenced Lawrence quite a bit. Giap from Vietnam also referenced him. There is some anecdotal evidence that Che Guevara also read and picked up some things from Lawrence, but obviously he didn't do a real good job of it because he got whacked in Bolivia. Not that he didn't deserve it, but anyway. So it goes on from there. Sorry about that.
Listen, don't hold back, James. I mean, if you feel something is important to say, go ahead and say it. It's okay.
Yeah.
Our audience can handle it.
Well, Jay screwed up.
He had a bad day at the office.
Yeah.
So, James, is there, without Lawrence, is there an Arab revolt?
I doubt it. I mean, it would have been more localized and the result would have been different. It would not have been as influential in the ending of the campaign as it was, I think. What legacy it would leave for the Arab nations, I doubt that would have changed much of anything, because most of the Arab nations now refuse to even acknowledge that Lawrence and the British helped them in World War I, which is their absolute right to do. But probably most importantly, Lawrence and Faisal and the Northern Arab Army played a key part in the final campaign. Allenby's strike towards Damascus at the very end of the campaign, and without the Arab army and without Faisal, it would have been questionable about whether or not they would have succeeded as well as it did.
Right.
Yeah, James, you've been involved in some archaeological work in this area, and in your bio, it describes you as a conflict archaeologist. And I know that you've been involved were involved for a few years in some very specific Lawrence related archaeology. And I wondered if you could tell us about that and tell us sort of about the epiphany it led you to.
Well, it actually started out when I was in Southern Africa studying another campaign when the South Africans attacked the Germans in their colony of Southwest Africa. It was the first campaign that the South African army had ever taken beyond its border. And I was out in the desert, very similar terrain to what is today in Jordan and the Hejaz. And I was looking for some sources on how best to look at this, how best to exploit it, and came across a group called the Great Arab Revolt Project. And it's a mostly British-based operation that ran for 10 years. Basic premise was to follow the 7 pillars of wisdom to establish how much of it was accurate, how much of it was embellishment.
And I should just say the 7 pillars was I'm doing the thing that it always irritates me when NPR hosts do it, but I'm going to do it now as well. That the 7 pillars is Lawrence's book about this campaign, which many people have, as you say, attacked as being fanciful.
Fanciful, embellished, one-sided, a number of things. But if you read the very first paragraph of the book, he says, this is my story. I played a very small part in the war, and the other people can write their own books if they want. I thought that was completely fair. He mentions a lot of the people in the book. Anyway, I thought joining this operation for the last couple of years that it was running would help me in my work in Africa, which it did quite a bit. But while I was there, we followed the Hejaz Railway from Damascus down to Mecca and Medina, which was basically the focus of the whole Arab revolt during those 3 years. And that's one of the bridges, obviously. The hard part about it was we knew where all the Turkish positions were, but because the Arabs and Lawrence and the British advisors were fighting a mobile warfare, also moral probably, hopefully, they were very elusive, and we could not find anything other than perhaps the bullets that they had fired at the Turkish positions. One day, we were looking at a lead, a Royal Flying Corps map that mentioned a place called Tooth Hill. And a couple of references in 7 Pillars of Wisdom that talked about a possible overnight position where the British had stopped before they had launched a couple of operations. We went to that location, and in the lower right of that picture, you can just barely see a black spot, and that's actually one of the archaeologists. About where he is standing, we found a campfire and remnants of wood food cartons or wood cases, and most interestingly, a piece of pottery that came from a World War I British ration jug marked SRD,
Yes.
which stands for Service Ration Depot. Some people say it says something about rum, but in any event, we started to look around this location and realized that this was the campsite that they had used on a number of occasions. And one of the things, amongst others, that we found there was some British ammunition. This is where we go in.
There you go. That's it.
This is a British 303 round. It was unfired, although the primer was dented, which meant that someone had tried to fire it. And then thinking about this for the whole, there was a grouping of about 70 rounds laying on the ground. And what we had to figure out was, why was this ammunition on the ground? Most of it was expended ammunition, fired. It had been fired, but there was no battle there. There was no indication that there had been any conflict in the neighborhood. And the only thing I could come up with was those rounds had been fired inside or from one of the armored car machine guns. And when they fired their ammo, the expended rounds tumbled out inside the turret and landed inside the car. They were not ejected outside the car. So they came back to the camp. What's the first thing you do when you have a soldier that doesn't have anything to do? You have to clean up the equipment. So they swept the rounds out on the ground. So this is why we found all this ammo here. We found other things like components of cars. We found a spark plug that had been removed from a car, and it matched one of the Rolls-Royce spark plugs. Found a tire air valve cap, a brass one about this big. So it told us this was one of the camps that the British had used. It was the first actual concrete evidence we had found of the British. And it was through thinking about this, about the Royal Flying Corps map that had led us there, about the camp that was there, and the armored cars, the artillery, the mobile artillery had been there, and also the Arab cavalry, the camels, and the horses had been there. And that's where I started to put together my thoughts on combined operations. And the man that led this was a guy by the name of Colonel Downey, who was basically Lawrence's chief of operations. Although he outranked Lawrence, he had no experience in guerrilla warfare, but he came from the Coldstream Guards and was an elite in the British Army. He put together a number of attacks, wrote the operations orders, gave them to Lawrence and said, okay, this is what I think, this is how we should do it. And Lawrence said, let's do it. So this was sort of the culmination, or the beginning of the culmination of these, what had been singular raids of horses or camels on the railway. Now they're combining everything. They're combining the Air Force, the artillery, the armored cars, and the ground forces to attack these Turkish positions. That from that location, they went out. There's a map in the book that shows how they operated from that location. And over the period of about 5 days, actually, there's another map, but that's not the one.
Okay, yeah. Wrong map.
You're
not allowed to see that map now, people. Sorry.
It's in the book. They carried out a number of raids, and then went back to their camp close to the coast, where they were well protected. But it was classic commando kind of combined operations raids, and that gave me that gelled my thoughts on the subject and where I began to write the book.
Well, James, based on the work you did with that project, do you feel safe in saying is Seven Pillars on the money, or is it a great work of historical fiction? Or
well, the two directors of the, don't you hate it when a person never answers the question directly? Anyway, Neil Faulkner and I've forgotten the other gentleman's name offhand. I'll remember it later on when I'm not talking to you. Neil Faulkner wrote a book also that is more about the overall campaign in the Middle East. There's another one being written by Nick. Anyway, basically what they determined over their 10 years, and I agree with them, is that the book is accurate. There may be a couple of embellishments. There may be some things that Lawrence wanted to tell us, but had to tell us in other ways. So yeah, question in two words, or maybe three, it's accurate.
Okay, fair enough. Now, you have a special interest, I think it's fair to say, in the armored car section. The cover of the book, which I'll just show once again because, why not? The author always likes it when you show the cover of the book. So we'll point it out here. But the cover of the book has a picture of the armored cars on the cover. And in addition to that, you have not an armored car, but a version of one of the cars that was used in these operations, that this belongs to you. So tell us about your interest and tell us about this vehicle that's James Stejskal's vehicle.
My wife hates me because of these things, but I have some eclectic interests, and one of them is Zeppelins. But the World War I.
You own a Zeppelin?
No, that's the thing. The Zeppelins are just too big to build in the backyard.
Well, Rick likes inflatable.
I have an inflatable tank. If I have an inflatable tank, I don't see why you can't have a Zeppelin.
Well, actually, I've been thinking about building one of the command cars for one. Yeah, about that time.
Get the whole squadron together.
Indeed.
But tell us about this one. Is this a Rolls Royce?
But my second interest, one of my second interests, is vintage cars, and this is a Rolls Royce, a 1919 Rolls Royce, which was essentially identical to the Rolls Royces of 1914, which were the ones that were used by Lawrence, by the armored car detachment. I found this car in disassembled condition with an original two-seater body, a civilian body, and proceeded to restore it. And at the same time, I was working on the book. And so I figured the body was going to take several years to do correctly. So in the meantime, I thought, well, why not? Let's go build a copy of one of Lawrence's Rolls Royce. This incorporates some of the design features of about three or four of the different cars. But it is a very accurate representation. The only thing on that is new is the wooden body, which is made from ash. The headlamps, basically all the metalwork you can see belong to the original car, and will be on the original car when I finally do put the other body on. But this is an accurate representation of a tender, and it was the vehicle that Lawrence's armored car detachment would use to accompany the armored cars to carry supplies. The armored cars were very heavy, very cramped, and could barely carry three people. So they couldn't carry gasoline, they couldn't carry explosives, they couldn't carry extra people or ammunition or fuel. So when the armored cars went out, the tenders went along with them. Tender being a naval term for a support ship. And since the armored car detachment started out with the Royal Navy Air Service, that's where they acquired the name. So that is my rendition of a Rolls Royce tender.
James, I'm going to sound like a 5-year-old boy here for a second, but that's just cooler than hell. I got to tell you.
There are a number of people that agree with you. And when the Vickers I have is mounted in the back, it's even cooler.
Yeah.
And I mean, you said the body is wooden.
The green gray part is made from ash. There are
metal on the original.
Metal fenders. The hood is aluminum. Original aluminum.
Would the body have been aluminum originally?
For a tender?
Yeah.
No, they were made in Cairo. Basically, or the Alexandria Depot. And as far as I can determine, they were probably made from packing crates that came across with equipment. So they actually started out as armored cars, but when they realized that they didn't have enough transport capability, they stripped the armor off of two of them or three, and then built a provisional wooden body on top of them. Each one was different. Each one had different characteristics. Some of them had no doors, but they all could carry. There are pictures of these things basically stacked up. They look like a camel coming out of off the Silk Road. The pile of stuff is about 20 feet in the air and covered with a net, and the back end of the car is about dragging on the ground. But they were amazing vehicles. These were the only ones that could keep up with the armored cars. The armored cars, even though they were carrying about 2 tons of steel plate armor, could still do 60 to 70 miles an hour across that terrain. The tenders could do a bit more than that, obviously, because they were quite a bit lighter.
Yeah, but the gas mileage would not have been great.
10 miles to the gallon, 14 maybe for the tender. For the armored cars, you were doing about 4 miles a gallon, which is about the equivalent of what an M1 Abrams can do.
So James, Neil Sharer, we're kind of switching gears here, but we have a bunch of questions. Neil, and this might have something to do with the fact that he's an Air Force guy, but we won't get into that. He wants to know, why did Lawrence find it necessary to use a pseudonym after the war to join the RAF?
Lawrence changed his name a couple of times after he got out. As you said at the very beginning, Lawrence was a very shy individual. There's a lot of people that have made claims about his proclivities, none of which have been ever definitively proved. But the one thing that is sure is he shunned proximity to most people, especially women. There's nothing that says he was homosexual or anything like that. He just apparently did not get along intimately with people very well. But he also shunned publicity, and to get away from things, he changed his name and disappeared. Although generally they found out who he was before too long, because he was basically the most famous, one of the most famous guys that came out of World War I.
And he was partly, sorry,
Rick.
He was famous in large part because an American named Lowell Thomas came over looking for a story with a cameraman named Harry Chase, I think, looking for a story. And at first he thought Allenby was his great story, but when he started doing his lectures with film clips of them, he soon realized that Lawrence was the great story. And so he really made Lawrence a celebrity even within a year or two of the end of the war, didn't he?
He did. And his account is not always reliable, probably much less reliable than anything else written about Lawrence. He did not spend that much time with him, but he tended to elaborate a bit freely with the facts. One point, I think he said that Lawrence carried a Western style 6-shooter, and I think he may have decided that was something that would his American audience would like, that Lawrence was some sort of a wild cowboy or something like that. But Lowell Thomas did more than anyone to shoot Lawrence into fame. Whether or not Lawrence enjoyed that is not really clear, but may have been one of the big reasons why he had to change his name, or decided to change his name and disappear quite often.
Lowell Thomas had coined a great phrase regarding Lawrence that people have used over the years, that he had a talent for backing into the limelight, meaning presumably that he was at one time, he was sort of on one hand shy and maybe not pushing himself forward, and yet somehow he was at the same time doing stuff that ended up with him being in the limelight.
That may not be entirely inaccurate. He he still promoted himself to. I think he wanted to promote his role, his book, but he did not so much enjoy being hounded by the press or
Sure.
people who wanted to corner him in wherever.
Well, he had the celebrity blues, I guess, that fame is never exactly what you want it. We are approaching the end of our hour, and we have a couple of more features to do. So, James, we have enjoyed this immensely. Thank you so much for joining us. And we appreciate you being here. And I want to say just again, our guest is James Stejskal, which is spelled Stejskal. And his book is Masters of Mayhem, Lawrence of Arabia and the British military mission to the Hejaz. And the Hejaz is the name for the desert that they're operating in.
That's correct. It's the western desert of Saudi Arabia that goes up into Jordan.
So I want to thank you, James, so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Well,
Thanks, Jim. And I just want to say that while we have him, I've read a fair bit about Lawrence, and I got to say, James' book, new stuff that's really fascinating. It's a great read, and please check it out. We'll give everybody all the bibliographic information and the links. But even if you think you know something about Lawrence and the Arab Revolt, you don't know it all yet. So check out the book.
Well, thank you, Greg.
All right, James, thank you so much.
It's been very enjoyable to be here.
Thanks for joining us.
And we'll stay in touch.
Certainly. Take care. Have a good weekend.
Oh, sorry, I cut you off before you were done.
Cut me off.
Hey, bye. We're leaving now. You know, we got to get a director, Chris, so that I think myself. Before we leave this topic, we have a mutual friend who did send us a couple of pictures. So we do want to thank George Luz for sending us some pictures of his trip to Wadi Rum there in Jordan, and a great picture here. We want to just say there he is, Luz of Arabia.
Luz of Arabia, yes.
You know, and so I don't know. I'm not sure what else to say about that. So stopping. Chris, I think that you have a history happened here to tell us about.
I do. This is this walk that we did yesterday around London, and I came across something that I thought had a really fascinating little story to it. And hopefully you can put some pictures up there. There's a thing in London that you pass along right by the Embankment tube stop, and it's called the Needle, or Cleopatras Needle. I must have passed it 100 times over the years, and it was given in 1801 to the British people in commemoration of their victories at Trafalgar and other battles against Napoleon in Egypt. There were 3 of them, actually, and they've now been scattered. This one made it to London, but it sat in Alexandria until 1877, when it finally made its way back to London, and it was put up along the Thames and has a great bit of Victorian ironwork around it, which you see there, called Cleopatra's Needle, and drew the attention of many people. And some of the people that it drew attention to was Imperial Germany. As the Germans are wont to do, they like to fly over London. But on September 4th of 1917, during one of the very first Zeppelin raids on London, a large bomb was dropped by Cleopatra's Needle there, and it caused quite a bit of damage. So, Rick, I hope you... That is my daughter Madeline sitting in front of one of the Victorian sphinxes that are by the Needle, and you can see a lot of the bomb damage there along the base of the statue and in the statue itself, which I just thought was kind of an interesting tie-in with our talk this week, and also just an interesting story about the Zeppelin raids on London, which again is the Blitz before the Blitz. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Excellent, and it's also, I mean, we're all in for the Chris part here.
Oh, wait.
it's your turn for the history joke of the week.
Okay, well, since there's finally starting to open up here in London, I would like to have a question for you, Rick.
Okay.
Where did Peter the Great get his coffee?
Where did Peter the Great get his coffee? I don't know, Chris. Where?
Zarbucks.
Oh.
Moving on.
I think you're going to have to finish up the show yourself, Chris. That is an excellently bad dad joke for Father's Day.
Hey.
So I totally approve. I want to thank everybody for joining us this week and remind you we will post with just I'll put it up actually just as soon as we get off the air, the link to our reading list, which includes books for this week. And I want to mention that next week we are going to have we're switching gears again as we are wont to do, and we're going to have on Dan King, author of The Last Zero Fighter, and he's interviewed a bunch. I want to say more than 100, but I might be off there, of Japanese pilots who were fighter pilots in the Pacific in World War II. And he's going to share with us kind of the war from their perspective. So I think that'll be really interesting and different. And I, for one, am really looking forward to that.
Absolutely.
And do we have anything else to do before we play the Ghost Army close? All right. We will see many of you next week. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions for us, email us at hhh@stephenambrosetours.com or post them on Facebook. Thanks.